Excuse me, everyone. Sex! Now that I have your attention...
You don't have our attention.
Money!
I'm listening.
So sex sells, right? It's sex equals big money for advertisers, for TV, for film, all the things that want our attention and want to hold our attention, and sex is a powerful tool for that. And considering that we're the most media-saturated company in history, chances are, theoretically, we've been exposed to more sexual content than any humans in history. And that sexual content on television has been given to us in very unrealistic ways. I'm an avid TV watcher, but honestly, from the context of a student who likes to study television, I like the writing, the construct of telling stories over long form in terms of seasons. Read a lot of books on the history of the American sitcom, from I Love Lucy to Modern Family and the evolution of it over the years. So I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of how sex has been portrayed in television, from conservatism to more liberal takes on it, but for the most part, I believe that sex is often portrayed unrealistically, biologically, and in terms of risk consequence. And I believe that can be harmful given the way our brains work and the formulas used by media companies to give media messages, as well as I do think that if sex were presented in a more realistic context, it could be educational. So first of all, biologically speaking, the main thing is sex is always portrayed as instantaneous. Two people run into a room, fall in bed, and they're immediately having sex. Biologically speaking, we know that men need to achieve erections, women need to naturally lubricate, and in real world scenario, this is usually achieved through foreplay, and which is non-existent on television. Television skips foreplay and goes straight to sex. The problem is, in normalizing instantaneous sex, and these bodily functions as instant, it can lead to painful sex, it can lead to vaginal tearing, and it can lead to people questioning their own biological adequacy and saying, well, what's wrong with me? These bodily functions are not instantaneous, because they think, well, this TV sex is how it's supposed to be. And that's just not true. And then in terms of risk and consequence, in terms of television, consequence defined as an unintended result from sex, right? So when we know that pregnancy can happen, and if it's unwanted pregnancy, abortion and adoption enter into the conversation. Those are heavy things. STDs, emotional scarring. We know there's a lot of risk and consequences when someone decides to engage in a sexual lifestyle. And so that have to be considered in the real world. However, television's not the real world, and they exclude that completely, right? So, STDs are rarely going to be a part of the plot of an American sitcom, especially abortion and adoption. Those are usually not going to be in the script because these are fictional characters and people dictate the story, which is unfortunately not how life works. Someone's not writing our script. And therefore, when we enter into sexual relations in real life, there's so much more to consider, so much more risk and consequence. But the fact is there's arguments for the status quo of television, that it's condensed storytelling, so the sex in there has to be condensed, and that television is not a guide to life. And I get that, I understand that. But we have to factor in, how does the brain work, And the fact is there's an automaticity to our brain in which we're conditioned to form an autopilot system that filters out messages because we get so many in a day. We can't analyze everything that comes our way. And so a lot of the information that enters our brain, especially something like television, which we automatically are predisposed to say, well, we don't have to think that hard about a sitcom. It's just information comes in and it's just good information. That's how we see it. And so we don't analyze it. We don't ask deep questions about a lot of the television we consume. And we also have a fantasy reality continuum always happening in our brain, in which we're determining what's real, what's fake. And especially because the most general formula thrown at us by media companies is the next step reality formula, which gives us both. We're going to give you a reality element that you can relate to, and we're going to give you a fantasy element to help you escape because we're entertainment. And so a quick example is driving a car. I drive a car. Most of us drive a car. This is a real world experience. Vin Diesel drives a car in Fast and the Furious franchise, movies. Again, something we do. The difference is he'll drive a car out of a skyscraper and into another skyscraper, and he will get out. No scratches on his bald head, no scratches on the car, and walk away, and we see him in the next movie. And so it took a reality element that we all can relate to and that we do, stripped it of its consequence, stripped it of its reality and its risk, and gave us a fantasized version of it. Now, most people don't leave the theater and drive their cars through buildings, but a lot do get in their car and all of a sudden feel maybe a little more empowered, more lead in their foot. They might peel out, and because the lines got blurred, all of a sudden, that fantasy and reality got brought together in a way that says, well, there's some wiggle room here. And we can do that with sex. TV can do that with sex in that it can take this real world experience that most of us have or will or, want to experience, take the risk off of it, take the reality from it, and present a fantasized version of it and say this is it. And then when those lines get blurred, we start to think maybe that's attainable, And so in terms of maybe sex being educational, if presented in a realistic fashion on television. There was a Canadian television show when I was a teenager, a sexually active teenager, called Degrassi, The Next Generation, and it presented the whole picture of sex in that show, unlike something like that 70s show that just kind of packaged sex into the narrative as humor, and all the risk and consequence was camouflaged by the humor of that 70s show and made sex feel safe and consequence free for a teenager. Degrassi gave you storylines that involved teenage pregnancy, abortion, revenge porn, sexting, emotional scarring. It said here's the entire picture of sex, especially for a teenager. That it's normal. It's a normal part of a teenager's life, whether conversationally or physically. It's going to exist in a teenager's life, but here's the whole picture that if you don't enter sex safely, if you don't enter it with respect for another person's emotions and in their body, here's the plethora of risk and consequence that can happen. And so as a teenager, that was very informative. It was very educational. I respected that. And so in conclusion, sex is all over the place in television. Whether you're watching, Game of Thrones in which it's in your face, or, Modern Family where it's in the subtext. And it's going to be always packaged in a fantasized, unrealistic way. And we have to, flex our media literacy muscles to be able to distinguish those things and determine fantasy from real life. But something to think about is the fact that TV's leaving cable, it's leaving networks, it's leaving regulation essentially. Anything on TV is regulated to ratings and the content it can show. Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, they don't have those regulations. They can show whatever they want, and they don't have to warn you that this is rated this and that this show contains this. And therefore, given the fact that younger audiences coming up behind us are already getting most of their information from screens, from tablets, from laptops in schools, most the written word's kind of dying off and most information comes from screen, their generation's actually going to have a harder time than we did. So, figuring out fantasy from reality when everything comes from a screen, and there's a real risk that the hyper fantasized sex that's probably going to be more prevalent to their generation is going to confuse and distort their view of realistic sex.